On a September morning in 2021, a small research team based at Trinity College Dublin uploaded a paper to the journal Science Advances that quietly detonated 100 years of assumptions about where the Japanese people came from. There was no press conference, no breaking news alert, nothing that looked like the moment history gets rewritten. Just a technical paper, dense with statistics, sitting in an academic database. But buried inside that paper was a number that should stop you in your tracks. According to the genetic analysis, roughly 71% of the ancestry carried by modern Japanese people traces back to a population that arrived in Japan less than 2,000 years ago. A population so poorly documented that researchers still cannot say exactly who they were, where precisely they came from, or why they came in such overwhelming numbers. 71%. Not a minor genetic footnote. Not a small contribution folded into a larger, better understood story. The dominant slice of the ancestry of over 120 million people, sourced from a population that history books never named because history, until DNA testing caught up with it, did not know they existed. If that sounds impossible, if it sounds like the kind of claim that gets walked back a year later, understand that it has not been walked back. It has been confirmed, refined, and expanded by follow-up research ever since. So if you are ready to find out how a civilization can contribute the majority of a modern nation's genetic code and still remain functionally invisible to written history, stay with this video and hit subscribe, because what comes next will change how you think about where Japanese identity actually comes from. For most of the 20th century, the story of Japanese origins felt settled, almost boring in its simplicity. Anthropologists studying skeletal remains kept noticing something odd. Japanese skulls, bone structures, and facial proportions did not match neighboring Chinese and Korean populations as closely as geography would suggest, given how physically close the islands sit to the Asian mainland. That mismatch nagged at researchers for decades. In the 1990s, a physical anthropologist named Kazuo Hanihara proposed an explanation that became the standard model taught in textbooks for the next 30 years. He called it the dual structure hypothesis. The idea was straightforward. Japanese ancestry came from two distinct sources. The first were the Jomon, a population of hunter-gatherers, fishers, and foragers who lived across the Japanese archipelago for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, roughly 16,000 years ago down to around 3,000 years ago. The Jomon were not primitive by any reasonable definition. They produced some of the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere on Earth, built semi-permanent settlements, and developed a rich material culture based on fishing, hunting, and gathering wild plants, all without ever adopting agriculture in any significant way. Then, starting somewhere around 900 BCE and continuing through roughly 300 CE, a second population entered the picture. The Yayoi arrived from the Asian mainland, most likely by way of the Korean peninsula, bringing wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron metalworking, and new social structures that would eventually reorganize Japanese society from the ground up. According to the dual structure model, these two populations mixed over the following centuries, with the Jomon contributing a smaller genetic share and the Yayoi contributing the larger share, and the proportions of that mixture shifting depending on region. Okinawans in the south retained more Jomon ancestry. Populations in central Honshu carried more Yayoi ancestry. It was a clean, satisfying story, and for a long time the genetic evidence available, mostly small fragments of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers, seemed to support it well enough. It is worth sitting with just how long the Jomon period actually lasted, because the number tends to slide past people too quickly. 16,000 years is not a typo. That is a cultural tradition that persisted, adapted, and continued producing recognizable pottery styles and settlement patterns for a length of time longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization everywhere else on the planet combined. Jomon communities built pit dwellings, developed increasingly sophisticated fishing and hunting technology, and left behind an archaeological record scattered across the length of the archipelago, from Hokkaido in the north down through Kyushu in the south. When the Yayoi arrived centuries later, they were not stepping into an empty landscape. They were entering a region already occupied by a population with its own deep, established identity, and the interaction between these two groups, gradual in some places and more abrupt in others, set the template for the layered ancestry story that would later prove even more complicated than anyone initially suspected. The problem was that small fragments of DNA can only tell you so much. As sequencing technology improved through the 2000s and into the 2010s, researchers gained the ability to read entire genomes instead of a handful of markers, and when they applied that new resolution to modern Japanese populations, the numbers stopped adding up cleanly. There was a component in the genetic signal that the dual structure model simply could not account for. Something was missing from the equation, a hidden contributor that nobody had previously identified or measured. This is where the 2021 study becomes so significant. Led by geneticist Shigeki Nakagome, working with a joint team spanning Trinity College Dublin and multiple institutions across Japan, the researchers sequenced whole genomes from 12 ancient human remains recovered from Japanese archaeological sites spanning the Jomon, Yayoi, and a later period known as the Kofun era. When they compared these ancient genomes against each other and against modern Japanese DNA, the dual structure model collapsed. It was not that the Jomon and Yayoi contributions were wrong, it was that they were incomplete. Modern Japanese ancestry, the data showed, comes not from 2 sources, but from 3. And the third source, the one nobody had accounted for, turned out to be the largest single contributor of all. That third component is now called Kofun ancestry, named for the period in Japanese history running from roughly 300 CE to 700 CE. The Kofun period gets its name from the massive burial mounds built during this era, some shaped like enormous keyholes when viewed from above, some stretching hundreds of meters in length, and requiring the kind of centralized labor and political authority that simple chiefdoms could never organize. This was the era when the Yamato state emerged as the dominant political power on the Japanese archipelago, when Japan began keeping its own historical records, and when contact and exchange with mainland Asian states intensified dramatically. Historians already understood that the Kofun period mattered politically and culturally. What nobody understood, until whole genome sequencing revealed it, was that this same period also represented the single largest demographic transformation in the entire genetic history of the Japanese people. The keyhole-shaped tombs themselves are worth pausing on because they are not subtle structures easy to overlook. Some of the largest, including the tomb traditionally associated with Emperor Nintoku near modern Osaka, rank among the largest funerary monuments ever constructed anywhere in the world by surface area, surrounded by moats and dotted with rows of clay figures known as haniwa, shaped into warriors, animals, houses, and boats. Building monuments on this scale required a level of coordinated labor, resource extraction, and political command that simply did not exist earlier in Japanese prehistory. Historians had always treated the Kofun period as the moment Japan transitioned from scattered regional chiefdoms into something resembling an early unified state under Yamato authority. What genetics has now added to that picture is the realization that this same transitional period was not simply a political and technological shift managed by the existing population. It coincided with, and was very likely driven by, an enormous influx of new people. According to the tripartite model that emerged from the 2021 research, modern mainland Japanese populations carry approximately 13% Jomon ancestry, roughly 16% Yayoi ancestry, and around 71% Kofun period ancestry. Read that again. The population that arrived during a 500-year window, roughly 1,700 years ago, contributes more genetic material to living Japanese people than the indigenous hunter-gatherers who occupied the islands for 16,000 years and the rice-farming migrants who arrived centuries earlier, combined. So who were these Kofun migrants, and where did they actually come from? The genetic data points toward East Asia broadly, with the closest modern comparison being populations related to Han Chinese ancestry, suggesting these migrants originated somewhere on the East Asian mainland rather than being a simple continuation of the earlier Yayoi migration from the Korean peninsula. This is genuinely strange when you sit with it. The Yayoi had already established a mainland connection centuries earlier. Why would an entirely separate, larger wave of migration arrive later from a different or more diffuse source? And why would it leave such a comparatively thin trail in the archaeological and historical record, given how enormous its genetic impact turned out to be? Researchers studying the period have proposed connections to the chaotic political landscape of East Asia during the first several centuries of the Common Era. This was not a quiet time on the mainland. The Han Dynasty in China collapsed around 220 CE, fracturing into the Three Kingdoms period and decades of warfare and instability that followed. On the Korean peninsula and in the Manchurian region to its north, a shifting patchwork of states rose and fell, including well-documented kingdoms like Goguryeo and the smaller state of Buyo, both of which maintained complex relationships, sometimes cooperative and sometimes violent, with Chinese dynasties and with each other. Against that backdrop of collapse, war, and political reshuffling across the mainland, it makes sense that populations would be displaced, that groups would flee instability in search of safer or more prosperous territory, and that an island nation like Japan, relatively insulated by the sea and increasingly organized under emerging state structures of its own, would look like an attractive destination. But here's the part that keeps researchers cautious rather than triumphant. Having a plausible historical backdrop is not the same as having a confirmed identity for the migrants themselves. The ancient genome samples available from the Kofun period and from candidate source regions across the Korean peninsula, Manchuria, and northern China during this specific window remain limited. Scientists can measure the genetic signature these migrants left behind with real precision. They can date roughly when the migration occurred. They can estimate how large its demographic impact was. What they cannot yet do, with the sample sizes currently available, is point to a specific historical population, give it a name, and say with full confidence, this was them, and this is exactly where their homeland stood. That gap between measurable genetic impact and confirmed historical identity is exactly why some researchers and popular science writers have taken to describing this Kofun period source population as a kind of ghost population, a group whose genetic fingerprint is unmistakable in the DNA of the living, while their political history, their language, and their own account of themselves remains stubbornly out of reach. Follow-up research since 2021 has only added texture to the mystery rather than resolving it outright. Additional studies examining the Kofun period genetic signal have suggested that the migration was not necessarily a single, unified wave from one homogeneous population. Instead, the evidence increasingly points toward multiple pulses of migration occurring over an extended period, potentially drawing from more than one source population across the mainland, which would help explain some of the complexity and internal variation found within the Kofun genetic signal when researchers examine it region by region across Japan. In other words, the ghost population may not even be a single ghost. It may be several distinct groups arriving in overlapping waves whose genetic contributions have since blended so thoroughly that separating them cleanly is its own ongoing challenge for the field. Some researchers working on this problem have suggested that later waves of Kofun period migration may have continued well into the centuries that followed the initial influx, meaning the demographic transformation was not a single dramatic event confined to one generation, but a prolonged process stretched across a much longer window than the label Kofun period alone might suggest. If that turns out to be correct, it would mean modern Japanese ancestry reflects not three clean migration events, but a longer, messier sequence of arrivals, absorptions, and further arrivals, each one leaving its own subtle signature layered on top of the last. The regional patterns within Japan today still echo this layered history in ways that are genuinely striking. Okinawans in the far south carry the highest proportion of Jomon ancestry of any modern Japanese population, in some studies exceeding a quarter of their total genetic makeup, a legacy of relative geographic isolation from the mainland migrations that transformed Honshu more thoroughly. Populations in the Tohoku region of northern Honshu also retain elevated Jomon signal compared to central and western Japan. Meanwhile, the populations of central and western Japan, the historical heartland of Yamato political power, and the epicenter of Kofun period state formation, show the strongest signal of Kofun ancestry of anywhere in the country, a direct genetic echo of where these later migrants settled most densely and where their numbers had the greatest demographic weight. These are not small academic footnotes. They map remarkably well onto regional, cultural, and linguistic differences that persist in Japan today, distinct dialects, distinct local traditions, distinct historical identities, all of it tracing back, at least in part, to how these three ancestral populations mixed unevenly across the archipelago rather than blending into one uniform whole. Consider what this actually means for how Japanese cultural identity has typically been described. Japan is frequently portrayed, both by outside observers and within certain strands of its own national narrative, as an unusually homogeneous society, a single people with a single continuous lineage stretching back into deep antiquity. The genetic reality uncovered by this research complicates that picture considerably. Modern Japanese identity is the product of at least three distinct ancestral populations, arriving in separate waves over a span of more than 15,000 years, each contributing different technologies, different social structures, and quite plausibly different cultural and linguistic elements that fuse together over time rather than descending in an unbroken straight line from a single point of origin. This may help explain long-standing puzzles that anthropologists and linguists have wrestled with for years. Why does Shinto, the indigenous religious tradition of Japan, contain elements that feel deeply rooted in the natural landscape and animistic in character, while simultaneously incorporating ideas about social hierarchy, imperial authority, and divine kingship that feel comparatively more recent in origin? A layered ancestry, arriving in layered waves, offers a far more coherent explanation than a single continuous cultural thread ever could. Why does the Japanese language contain grammatical structures and core vocabulary that resist easy classification alongside Chinese or Korean, despite obvious centuries of contact and borrowing between these societies? A blended population, formed from multiple source groups who originally spoke different languages before merging linguistically over generations, is a far more plausible origin story than a single unbroken linguistic lineage. It is worth pausing here to note that Japan is far from the only place where genetics has revealed a population contribution that written history simply failed to record. Ancient DNA research across Europe uncovered the existence of groups researchers now refer to as Western hunter-gatherers and, separately, a deeply influential lineage known as ancient North Eurasians, populations that contributed significantly to the ancestry of nearly every European alive today, despite the fact that written and archaeological records preserve only fragments of who they actually were. In the Americas, genetic research has shown that indigenous populations descend from earlier source populations that no longer exist in anything resembling their original form, lineages that contributed their genes forward before effectively vanishing as distinct, identifiable groups. Ghost populations, it turns out, are not a rare anomaly limited to one unusual case in East Asia. They appear again and again wherever researchers apply high-resolution ancient DNA analysis to a population's deep history, a pattern that should make anyone reconsider how confidently we can describe any modern population's origins using written and archaeological sources alone. In some of these European cases, researchers have gone so far as to describe the missing source populations using the language of ghost lineages precisely because their genetic influence is undeniable, while their cultural and political identity remains almost entirely reconstructed rather than documented. A group can shape the ancestry of tens of millions of descendants and still leave behind no name, no chronicle, and no monument that survived long enough for later civilizations to record. What makes the Japanese case stand out, even against that broader pattern, is how recent it is and how much documentation should theoretically have existed for a migration of this scale. This was not a Stone Age population movement lost to tens of thousands of years of silence before any form of writing existed anywhere on Earth. The Kofun period migration occurred during a stretch of history when China maintained detailed dynastic chronicles, when Korean states were recording their own histories, and when Japan itself was on the verge of producing its earliest written records. And yet a demographic event large enough to eventually account for roughly 70% of the ancestry of an entire modern nation occurred during this documented era, and still managed to leave only a partial, ambiguous trace in the historical sources that have survived. The only reason we know the scale of what happened at all is because DNA does not forget. Genetic information persists across generations in a way that written records, vulnerable to war, fire, decay, and simple neglect, often do not. The Kofun ghost population left their mark not in a surviving chronicle bearing their name, but quite literally in the cells of the people who came after them. The technology behind this discovery deserves real credit here too. Ancient DNA analysis used to be limited to tiny genetic markers, small fragments of mitochondrial DNA or narrow segments of the Y chromosome that happened to survive well enough in old bone to be recoverable at all. That was the level of resolution available when the dual structure hypothesis was first proposed, and it is part of why that model held up reasonably well against the limited evidence available at the time. Whole genome sequencing changes the picture entirely, allowing researchers to read millions of genetic data points from a single ancient sample rather than a handful, and to run sophisticated statistical models capable of teasing apart subtle mixture proportions between multiple ancestral populations with a level of precision that was simply not achievable even 15 years ago. This is why the field keeps producing what feel like sudden revelations. It is not that history keeps changing, it is that our ability to read the genetic record embedded in human remains keeps improving, and each improvement in resolution has the potential to reveal population movements that were always real, but were previously invisible to the tools available. For modern Japanese people, the practical upshot of all this research is a considerably more nuanced picture of personal ancestry than the old two-population story ever offered. Rather than descending from a straightforward blend of indigenous hunter-gatherers and one wave of mainland rice farmers, most Japanese individuals today carry a three-way genetic inheritance, with the largest single share tracing back to a population whose precise identity remains only partially resolved. Some individuals, particularly in Okinawa or parts of northern Honshu, carry a comparatively higher proportion of Jomon ancestry, connecting them a little more closely to Japan's original hunter-gatherer inhabitants. Others carry stronger Yayoi or Kofun signals, depending heavily on regional history and family background. Nearly everyone carries some combination of all three, a genetic record of multiple, separate historical migrations compressed into every cell of the body, whether or not any individual person has ever had reason to think about it in those terms. There is a broader lesson embedded in all of this that goes well beyond Japan specifically. We tend to imagine populations as fixed and rooted, as though any given people occupy a single continuous lineage tracing back cleanly to one clear point of origin. The genetic record, again and again across continents and time periods, tells a messier and frankly more interesting story. Populations move, they mix, they fragment and merge and mix again, often multiple times, often from sources that later generations lose track of almost entirely. Ghost populations are not some rare curiosity confined to one unusually mysterious case. They show up throughout the genetic history of nearly every population researchers have studied closely enough. And they exist as a standing reminder that our understanding of the human past is never really finished, only ever provisional, waiting for the next improvement in sequencing technology or the next batch of recovered ancient remains to rewrite it again. Research on this specific question is still actively ongoing. Geneticists continue sequencing additional ancient samples from Korea, from northern China, and from other regions across Northeast Asia, gradually building a more complete comparative map that may eventually help narrow down exactly which historical population or populations contributed the Kofun period genetic signal. Archaeologists are re-examining Kofun-era sites with fresh questions in mind, searching for material culture, burial practices, or technological markers that might correlate more precisely with specific mainland groups. Historians continue combing through the surviving Chinese and Korean chronicles from this period for passing references to population movements that might align with what the genetic timeline suggests. It is entirely possible that within the next decade, researchers will be able to identify this Kofun source population with far greater precision than is possible today. It is equally possible that the picture will remain permanently somewhat blurred, known primarily through the genetic legacy it left behind, rather than through any surviving record of its own making. Either outcome would say something remarkable about the limits and the power of historical inquiry, about how much of the past can vanish from written memory entirely while still surviving, intact and measurable, inside the DNA of the people descended from it. So the next time you think about where a modern nation's identity actually comes from, consider the Japanese case as a kind of case study in humility. A civilization contributed the majority of a modern population's ancestry, arrived during a period when written history should have captured it clearly, and still slipped almost entirely out of the historical record, only to be recovered nearly 2,000 years later through the careful sequencing of a handful of ancient bones. Somewhere in that quiet, unglamorous act of scientific patience is a genuinely remarkable story, not of aliens or lost super-civilizations, but of how ordinary human migration, displacement, and mixture can produce a population whose genetic fingerprint outlives every written trace of who they were. Sleep on that tonight. Somewhere inside your own genetic code, whoever you are, there is very likely a piece of some population history no one has fully reconstructed yet, a quiet echo of migrations and mixtures that vanished from memory long before anyone thought to write them down. And that, in the end, is what makes this particular discovery so difficult to shake once you actually sit with it. We are used to thinking of lost civilizations as things buried under sand or jungle, waiting for an expedition to physically uncover them. The Kofun ghost population was never lost in that sense at all. It was hiding in plain sight the entire time, carried forward silently in the blood of well over 100 million living people, in a country with one of the most extensively documented and carefully preserved historical traditions anywhere on Earth. Nobody needed to excavate a hidden temple or decode a forgotten script to find it. All it took was a needle, 12 sets of ancient bones, and a sequencing machine patient enough to read what the DNA had been quietly recording the entire time. That is the strange, humbling truth sitting underneath this whole story. The most significant population movement in the genetic history of Japan was never really lost. It was simply unread, waiting more than 15 centuries for the right tool to finally come along and translate it, sitting quietly inside living bodies the entire time, unnoticed until science finally learned how to ask the right question of the right cells.